of order. 10-minute rule motion. Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Mr Speaker, I seek leave to be given to bring a bill to establish a single custodial tenancy deposit scheme, to provide for that scheme to invest deposits, to require interest in such investments to be used for the provision of tenant advocacy, tenant support, arbitration services, and to establish a mandatory arbitration service for the resolution of disputes between landlords, tenants and for connected purposes. I need to declare an interest. I use the current deposit scheme as a landlord for tenants. It is a system that I don't believe works for landlords, and I don't believe it provides the safeguards that the last Labour government intended with the original legislation. Mr Speaker, I'm introducing this bill today partly because of the treatment of my constituent Andy Smith, who was living in an apartment owned by Baron Homes. He had a tenancy agreement to December 2018. In January of that year, he was offered council accommodation, of which he gratefully accepted. As his tenancy required, he got the mutual agreement in writing to break his lease. So you would imagine him fulfilling all aspects of his contract, he should be entitled to his £650 back. Sadly, that was not the case. Baron Homes alleged that there was damage to the property and they would keep the entire deposit. I have seen the photos of before and after that show that the damage they allege was pre-existing and some wear and tear. And in any regard, withholding the deposit was rather bad faith because the property was to be gutted and turned into 2 luxury studio flats. Of course, Brighton does have a history of rogue landlords, Van Hoogstraten, when I was growing up, and Baron Homes today have a woeful record of exploiting tenants in our city. So, of course, it was no surprise when Baron Homes forced Andy to challenge their decision through my deposits, who are the tenancy deposit scheme that Baron Homes, of course, choose to use. Judgment Day came, and my deposits ruled that there was no damage to the property, but they claimed that Andy had broken his lease early, so Baron Homes could keep the whole deposit as punishment. I thought to myself, there has been an error. And Andy had proof of the agreement to leave early, but as both the challenge and the withholding of the deposit was not on this point, he hadn't provided that letter as evidence. I wrote to my deposits with further information, and after chasing for months, I finally got a very simple letter from them. We don't do appeals, there is no right to review. When I went back to Baron Homes, their response was to threaten Andy. If he continued to complain, they would charge him, they would try and take him to the cleaners, charge him for the council tax of when he wasn't even in the property, and require him to settle the rent due. This required a set of further appeals, including going to Brighton Council, which I'm pleased ruled in Andy's favour. And the reality is, all this is commonplace in Brighton and many places up and down the country. And just like the law had to change to prevent the practices of people like Peter Ackman, whose name in the 1960s became a synonym for exploitation and intimidation, the law again needs to change to prevent, in my case, Miss Blenko, the director of Baron Homes, but many other landlords and agents across the country, to prevent their names becoming synonyms for unethical practices that we see today. And because of legal aid cuts, Andy, of course, has no access to legal advice, and his only route left now is, of course, an expensive challenge through the courts. Baron Homes and their partners in crime, my deposits, and landlords and agents across the country have effectively stolen my and many other constituents' money. And that's why, Mr Speaker, I'm here to introduce this bill. Michael Ball, Professor of Urban and Property Economics at the University of Reading, concludes the tenant depository scheme are very, very poor value for money. They currently cost the sector £275 million a year in fees and administrations, and last year alone they only released £7 million from disputed rents. The recent nationwide survey found that the average waiting time for return of deposits was nearly 2 months. And most people don't realise that about half of deposits aren't even held in the custodial scheme because they can be held in landlords but underwritten by their insurance, meaning that tenants have to complain to the insurance underwriter, which many don't. And even when they do, we've seen with my constituent, there is no right of appeal, no ability for precedents to be set when you do win cases, and of course, they have an incentive to keep the landlords happy because the landlords are their client. £4 billion is held in deposits in this country, almost all providing interest to the landlords or to the schemes and none to the tenants. Generation Rent suggested that I looked at the deposit scheme in New South Wales, Australia. This was a scheme set up in 1977, wholly administrated by the government and no third parties involved. There the landlord must actually deposit the bond with the scheme within 10 working days. No insurance here, no underwriting. And the scheme earned last year interest of 56 million Australian dollars. Half of it covers the cost of running the scheme, and $26 million is used to fund a range of services for tenants, including tribunal, advice, including legal advice, and advocacy programmes. Further low-income tenants can receive what is called Rent Smart Loan, which is an interest-free loan from the government to cover the costs of deposit, and it also makes it possible for renters to transfer the deposits between the tenancies. And it is this style scheme that I propose to introduce here. Turning back to this country, £4 billion of private renters' money is currently held, as I mentioned, and it serves no productive value. If I was to enrol that in an ISA account alone, that would produce £40 to £80 million of interest a year. My bill would create that single custodial tenancy deposit scheme, and it would eventually hold that £4 billion. And I would propose to use the money to fund two areas. Firstly, the bill would create an independent arbitration tribunal service who could hear disputes from landlords, agents and tenants, not only over deductions of deposits at the end of their lease, but also whether the landlord had fulfilled their obligation in, say, evicting tenants or complying with requirements for repairs on properties. It would be a way of abolishing no-fault evictions and provide tenants a way of seeking redress without costly court proceedings. Until recently, my deposits, in fact, even allowed landlords to withhold deposits without giving any reason whatsoever. This, along with their track record of due process, means that we need to cut them out of the system altogether. And when it comes to early legal support, it should be noted that £8 million would restore entirely the early league help for housing that was removed under LASBO Act in 2012. And on renters' unions is the other area that I would propose to spend the money. I'm a trade unionist and a cooperator. Unions and cooperatives turn power relations on their head, and after decades of privatisation in the housing market, landlords now have almost unprecedented powers in the lives of the renting public. In Brighton, we have a growing renters' union called Acorn. They are a democratic, member-led organisation that empower members with knowledge of their rights in the rental sector, and where required, they take direct action. If we funded these organisations, they would be able to provide legal support, advocacy and fight for members, just like trade unions or cooperatives can do. And I've seen them in Brighton make incredible successes, preventing evictions, winning repairs in dangerous properties, stopping banks requiring landlords to discriminate against tenants on housing benefits, and we could do that for all tenants across the country. We can change the law all we like in this place, but unless we empower people out there to have the tools and skills they require to hold their rights up, our words and laws here are hollow. This is why my bill would seek to establish a fund for renters' unions in this country, and it would fundamentally rebalance that power relationship between landlord and tenants. It would cost the Exchequer no money whatsoever, and it would provide justice in an area where we desperately need it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Order. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Marsha Di Cordova, Matt Weston, Faiz Al-Rashid, Yasmin Qureshi, Stella Creasy, Stephen Doherty, Gareth Snell, Paul Sweeney, Catherine West, Ruth George, Helen Hayes and myself.
It's a broad term. See if I can view
Lloyd Russell-Moyle.
Tenancy, Deposits and Arbitration Bill.
Second reading what day? Well done.
Friday the 22nd of March.
Friday the 22nd of March 2019. Thank you.